There is no such thing as unbiased history. All historians, I don't care who they are, all historians look at the events of the past and the present through the lens of their own experiences, expectations, and even preconceived ideas. And so villains and heroes are determined by those who write the history. I mean, think about this, folks. The rebellion in the American colonies of the 18th century is either the Revolutionary War, the War of Independence, or it's the First American War, or it's the war against the traitorous rebels in the American colonies, all depending on which side of the pond you're on. So you're either a hero or you're a villain, depending on which side of the, shall we say, which side of the aisle that you're on. And a person is either is a patriot if you win, and yet you are a traitor if you lose. It's all about perspective. And all of history, all of human history, all of recorded history falls into those ideas, that the historians are looking back, and they're looking back on what happened, filtered through their own experiences. And we need to understand that as we study. And so no matter how hard an historian it tries to be unbiased, it's simply not possible to be completely unbiased. Now, you can take some of the biases out, but you can't take them all out. And so next on Digging Deeper, I want to look with you at two men who play significant roles in the crucifixion of Jesus and ultimately in salvation history. Two men who have been vilified by church historians. Two tragic figures in salvation history. Judas Iscariot has been vilified for good reason since the 2nd century. First century, not a whole lot written, but since the 2nd century on, absolutely vilified and just completely destroyed after that. Church historians have been brutal as they talk about this weak man. But I want to take a look at what the Bible says is true about Judas. Okay, I'm not going to make any excuses for Judas, but I want us to understand, and I believe by knowing what the Bible tells us about him, we can understand a little bit about why he did what he did. See, the Bible tells us that Judas was a zealot. We know that there was at least one other zealot among the 12, and that would be Simon the Zealot. So I think that since his name was Simon the Zealot, we can assume that he was in fact the zealot. And the Zealots were a group of people who rose, who came to influence at the beginning of the 1st century. And they believed that Messiah would rise up and would kick the Romans out of Judea once and for all. And that he would establish the restored kingdom of Israel. Now, you see, the Zealots, they read the book of Daniel. They knew about his prophecies, that he prophesied that there would be 4 kingdoms that would arise. And this happened twice in the book of Daniel. That first of all, you were going to have Babylon, which is already in power. Nebuchadnezzar was that great king. And then you would have the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, followed by Greece. And then, of course, the 4th kingdom we know would be Rome. And then after that 4th kingdom, Messiah would come. Now, not only that, but Daniel was also very specific as to when this would take place. How long would it take before Messiah would show up? Now, I don't have time to go into that, but if you want a lot more details on that, you can just simply go back to the video that I did on Daniel's 70 weeks, and I talk about that. Now, the Bible is also very clear when Daniel gives these prophecies and when he's talking about these 4 kingdoms, the 4th kingdom is always in 2 parts. And now the Zealots missed that for some reason. Now, they're not the only ones. So many people miss that. You have 4 kingdoms and then Messiah. And so the Zealots believed that they would join any person who believed that they believed would be Messiah. And so, in other words, all they needed was they were looking for they were looking for a Judas Maccabeus kind of person, one who would rise up. Judas rose up against Antiochus Epiphanes and began the Maccabean revolt, which ushered in the Hasmonean Empire. And so they were looking for something like that, and they were ready to join forces with whoever would come in and would kick out the Romans. And they believed that if they were on the right side of history, that they would be honored and that they would have a place of power in the political civil service, if you will. And so they would join anyone who popped up. And there were a lot of guys popping up. In fact, Luke records for us Gamaliel, who was a well-known rabbi in the first century, who reminded the Sanhedrin when they were upset with Peter and John because of the fracas that happened in the silver and gold have I none kind of thing, that he reminded them of two such zealots who ultimately came to nothing. And so at this time, we have rebels arising was actually more the norm than the exception. And the reason for that was because people were looking for somebody who was going to throw off the tyranny of Rome. Now, from Judas's perspective, Judas actually found the real McCoy, or he found the real Messiah. And the thing is, folks, he wasn't wrong. Jesus is the real Messiah. Jesus, the rabbi from Nazareth, he was the real deal, and Judas saw that. I mean, Jesus, he healed the sick. He raised the dead. The wind and the waves obeyed him. He kicked demons out of people and threw them into pigs. I mean, he taught with authority, and he was an absolute thorn in the side of the religious leadership who were firmly established in the status quo. And they were very content that things remain where they are and they would continue to have power. And so Jesus was the one who would throw out the invaders of the land. And Judas was ready for that. I believe Simon was as well. And so as long as Jesus is doing messianic things, stuff is good. But the problem was that, and Judas finally figures this out, is that Jesus had no intention of kicking out Rome and setting up an earthly kingdom. I mean, you could almost see the wheels turning in Judas's mind. I mean, did he not understand Daniel's prophecies? I mean, Jesus is the Messiah. He needs to do messianic stuff. And he just needs to be a little push, a little nudge to do the right thing. And folks, I am convinced that this is the reason why Judas betrayed Jesus. The gospel writers are clear. They tell us that Judas tried to give the money back when he realized what he had done. And then, because of his remorse, he killed himself. Now, I am not making excuses for Judas. Judas was wrong. And what he did was heinous. And he would be judged for his actions. But folks, two things can be true at the same time. Judas was guilty of treachery. And he also loved Jesus. The problem was Jesus did not meet Judas's expectations. And in his disappointment, he acted. And the result of his actions was that Jesus was betrayed and he was arrested and he was brought before another person who has been vilified throughout history. Jesus was brought before Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate was the fifth governor of Judea. Now, there's a lot of things we don't know about Pilate. But we do know this, is the fact that somehow Pilate had got himself in trouble with the higher-ups, if you will, of the Roman aristocracy and the Roman government. Now, how do we know that? We know that because he ended up in Judea. Because nobody in the Roman civil service wanted to be the governor of Judea. Because you see, the Jewish Sanhedrin, they knew how to play hardball, and they made life miserable for any Roman official. I mean, we talk about herding cats. They were absolutely horrible. They had no problem throwing the governor under the camel, if you will, every time he stepped out of line. They had a beeline straight to Caesar, and they would whine and they would complain and they would get this guy in trouble all the time. And so they bring Jesus to Pilate, and Pilate knew that this was no political prisoner. I mean, he knew that the Jewish leaders, they didn't bring Jesus to him because out of some sense of duty. No. They brought him for trial because they were envious of him and his following. You see, this was a religious matter, and Pilate didn't want any part of that. It wasn't a political matter at all. And so he tells them that he finds no fault in this man, that he is innocent. You see, Pilate knew that Jesus was not guilty, and he also knew that Jesus posed absolutely no threat to Rome, as opposed to the Sanhedrin that's bringing Jesus to him. And so he tried to release him, and he tried time after time to get the leaders to see reason. And then came the cry from the crowd. It's just one sentence. But this is what ultimately condemned Jesus before Pilate. If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. For anyone who would make himself a king treasonably defies Caesar. Now, folks, this was a brilliant thrust that hit the mark clearly and directly and sealed Jesus' fate. Because they tell him, they said, Pilate, if you set this man free, we're going to send a delegation to Tiberius Caesar accusing you of condoning treason in one who would set himself up as a subversive counter-king to Rome, and also the failure to uphold our religious laws. And so, even though Pilate knew that Jesus was not going to do this, there was enough things that were being said, and all you have to do is just word things right, and the Jewish Sanhedrin were masters at that. And they had already been making Pilate's life miserable. Every time Pilate tried to do something nice in Judea, it would come back to bite him in the butt. And they would use this to have leverage over Pilate so that they could ultimately get what they want. And so, it's almost as though you can hear him thinking here. Do you recall Tiberius' threatening letter to you just 5 months ago, Pilate? Do you remember that? Now, he supported us then in the case of the golden shields, that you were trying to do the right thing and put the shields of Caesar, and it's actually a good thing, but it was in our temple, so therefore we whined to Caesar, and you got in trouble for that. Or the time that you tried to bring water into Jerusalem, which we desperately needed, because so many people would come into the city during the Passover leading up to Pentecost, that it was unsanitary. But yet you also knew that Rome wouldn't pay for it all, so you worked a deal with us. We were very happy to do it, to help bring the water in. The minute we found that people found out about it, we threw you under the bus. They got angry, went to Caesar, and you got in trouble for it. Don't you remember that, Pilate? You're already on thin ice with Tiberius. All we have to do is send one more letter saying that you were allowing a traitor to come up and to raise up an army against Rome, because we've already had a number of those that have risen up, and is costing Rome dearly to keep the peace here in Judea. And if we find out that you are siding with this rabble, what's going to happen to you? You see, if Tiberius supported us in the past to support us now, this is a far more serious matter. And you, Pilate, you will lose your membership in the Friends of Caesar Club. And your golden membership ring with Tiberius's image will be pulled from your finger, and you will make your exit via the usual means for disgraced members: exile or mandatory suicide. Now, folks, this club existed. High officials in the empire and some members of the Senate were privileged to join the elite fraternity of Amici Caesarus, the friends of Caesar. And no one left except under mortal disgrace. And so Pilate's resistance crumbled. You see, it was either Jesus or it was himself, and of course he opted for self. Now, folks, Pilate knew that Jesus was no threat to Rome. In fact, I would argue that Pilate understood Jesus better than anybody else in Judea. I mean, even better than his own disciples. But rather than do the right thing, Pilate saved his own skin by condemning a righteous man to death. Folks, Pilate was a coward. Pilate wasn't evil. He was afraid. And I would like you to think about something today. The Bible tells us that Jesus, as God incarnate, knows not only everything that will happen, but he also knows everything that could happen as well. This means that Jesus knew that Judas would betray him, and he chose him anyway. Jesus knew Pilate would not have the courage to stand up to the Jewish leaders, and he still put him in power. Now, the choices of Judas and Pilate were theirs, and they are prime examples of the frailty of the human condition. But here's the thing. See, not only does Jesus know everything that could happen and will happen, but he knows everything that could happen. So here's the thing, folks. Jesus knew that he needed to die. Jesus knew that he was the sacrifice of the new covenant. The sacrifice of the new covenant meant the forgiveness of sins. The only way you can do that is it's a blood sacrifice. Blood must be shed. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. Jesus knew that. And so Jesus knew that in the frailty of these people and the choices they made, and they were real choices. I'm not saying that God made them do it. I'm saying that God knew it was going to happen. I would argue it was part of his plan, but the choice was still theirs. And so, because again, remember that Satan himself wanted to set up a crossless Messiah. When he said, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you'll just disobey the Lord, act for yourself, decide for yourself what's right and wrong, bow down and worship me. Satan was willing to give up the temporal control and power if he could defeat God and not have a Jesus on the cross. He knew that. That wasn't a problem for him. And so what I want us to think about is this. First of all, I want us to think about the power of unmet expectations. So often people turn away from God because God does not meet their expectations. So we find this throughout the whole, from Thursday until Sunday, we will find example after example of Jesus not meeting expectations. But it's not that Jesus wasn't getting high enough. It's the fact that the people that he was dealing with who were upset about Jesus not meeting their expectations, they were thinking too low. They weren't thinking high enough. Because it is reasonable that this God who knows everything that will happen, everything that could happen, that it is reasonable that he will do the right thing. And of course, we know that Jesus did. So I don't know where either Pilate or Judas are. That's not my job. But I do think it's important that we take a look at how God is able to use the real human frailty and still have his purposes be met. Because folks, I got to tell you, that gives me hope. That even in my frailty, that God can still use me. Understanding, and he knows that I'm going to blow it. He knows that there are times when I'm going to say the wrong things. There are times I'm going to do the wrong things. And yet when I am faithless, he is still faithful. Why is that? Because he's God, and he can do that. And so as we continue to look through this last week of Jesus, and all these incredible lessons that we're being taught, understand that even in our horrible choices that we make, God can still use them for good. And I think I have to wonder if maybe Paul had that in mind in Romans chapter 8, where he says all things work together for good for those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. I don't think it's just that all the different choices that we make and the things that happen and the bad things that happen to us and all that. Can God work those out for good? Of course he can. But yet also when we look at what happened throughout what happens throughout human history and the real choices that people make that affect others, that God can still use them to work out his plan and to work out his purposes. And that, my friends, is so comforting to me. Because ultimately, when I understand that this creation is all about God and it's not about me, at that point, I can have true freedom. And at that point, I can serve him better because I know that he will work out through my frailty, through my imperfections, he'll still work out his plan. So I pray that you are blessed by these words. I pray that you're encouraged. I pray that as you worship the Lord this week, that you have an incredible time in God's presence. Again, if these videos are good for you, hit that subscribe button. Share them with your friends. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless you.